There's actually some people here I don't know. That's pretty cool. You know, Gary Vaynerchuk's in the other room, just so you know. Yeah. So if you want to catch him, then now's your chance. So I'm David Kadavy. I'm the author of the book Design for Hackers, Reverse Engineering Beauty. And this is due out with Wiley in September. So I'm still writing the book. And so today I've got about 20 minutes, so I will introduce the book. I'll present some content from the book. It's pretty heavy stuff for about 10 minutes, and then I'll take Q&A for about 10 minutes. So hopefully we can get all that worked in. So just to get an idea of who I'm talking to, who here would consider themselves, and you can fit into multiple categories. Who here would, he's going to go see Gary Vaynerchuk. Oh no, he's closing the door. Who here would consider themselves a developer? Okay. And anybody in like marketing or PR? Okay. And entrepreneurs? All of us, right? Any designers in the room? Okay, I'm in trouble. All right. So when I say design for hackers, I don't necessarily mean that you have to be a software developer to appreciate my book. I'm talking about people who just get things done and they learn whatever it is that they need to learn to achieve their vision. And so it just so happens that oftentimes involves learning how to code. But a lot of these entrepreneurs and developers are starting their own companies or working on apps of their own, and they need design. To compete today, you need to have good design. It's not really just icing on the cake anymore. But when you're bootstrapping, you don't have any money, and good design's pretty expensive. I know, I charge a lot of money. So sometimes it's just better to learn how to do things on your own. I mean, you learn everything that you need to learn to run your business or do everything else. And a lot of that stuff is available on the internet. And I think there's kind of a gap with design advice because sometimes it just tends to be a little bit too simple, or it's just made for designers. So like when you say use white space, what does that mean? There's a lot more of a thought process behind using white space than just the idea of using white space. And this is kind of unfortunate because developers come from this really sharing culture. They can teach themselves whatever they need to learn. If they're having trouble with something in Ruby on Rails, they can do a Google search or they can RTFM, and they can usually find an answer to their problem. And now, unfortunately, design advice doesn't work the same way. And this is where the reverse engineering beauty part of my book comes into play, is that I want to break down the thought processes that designers use to make things look beautiful. And so that way when you're viewing design, you can start to learn, so reverse engineering it. So that's a little bit about what the book is about. And now I'll present a little bit of content from the book. This will be pretty heavy stuff. It'll be like drinking through a fire hose, but I don't have a lot of time. So there'll be Q&A, and you can talk to me afterwards. So I want to talk about font selection today because people freak out about font selection a lot, and it doesn't have to be that complicated. There's so many other things that you can worry about in creating great design besides choosing fonts. And I think part of the reason that it's so confusing is that today we have kind of a paradox with font selection. So when Johannes Gutenberg printed the first Bible, it took him 16 years to cut out all these letters and to perfect the printing press and to print this book. 16 years. So if you think about 1995, and you think about how long it took for us to get from You've Got Mail to where we are now, that's how long it took for him to print one book. And so early printers like him used metal type, and metal type was not easy to work with. If you want to create a font in metal type, you've got to do all this filing down of little steel punches, and you have to punch it into copper, and then you create a mold, and then you pour lead and create a letter. And you have to do that for every letter, and you have to do that for every font, and you have to do that if you want a bold version, you have to do that all over again. If you want a different size, you have to do it all over again. And so it's like the equivalent of walking uphill both ways in the snow and 30 degrees below zero to get to school. But these designers created beautiful work. Just as an example, Garamond, Adobe Garamond is still in use today. That font's about 500 years old. Here's a page from Bodoni. We'll talk a little bit more about him in a little bit. So they created great work. And today we have the complete opposite of this. Instead of having a few really skilled craftsmen who are dedicating their lives to typography, instead we have anybody with access to a computer with access to thousands and thousands of fonts of varying quality, and it's really confusing. You don't really know what to use. So, in the first step towards understanding how fonts differ and what fonts to choose, it helps understand the categorizations. And there are literally dozens and dozens and dozens of categorizations of fonts, and these are the most popular categorizations that you see. And they're okay, but they don't do much to describe the personality of the font or the mood that it conveys or the philosophy behind them. They talk about fonts more from the decorative aspects. Just as an example, the idea of a sans serif font just means that, it doesn't have these little feet on it. When in fact, you can have two sans serif fonts that have completely different personalities. And to really understand where that comes from, you have to understand kind of the structure of the letters and what it was that made that font what it is. So I'll talk about a few of those, and then I'll explain a little bit about how you can tell the difference between those. So the first one that I want to talk about, I think that there are three. Now, this is a gross oversimplification for the designers in the audience. I apologize. But I think there's three that are really important. And the first one is Humanist fonts. And these are inspired by calligraphy. So when books were first being created, they were created by scribes, by monks, and it would take them years to letter the whole book. And, monks are busy, man. They made beer. So there were some production considerations. They wanted to get these books done, just like you want to get your work done. And so the letters kind of have a character to them that made them easy to be created by the human hand. And that just created forms that were a little more friendly. And so when books started being printed, they naturally wanted to make them look a lot like these scribed books, because that's what people were used to. And then eventually, fonts in books started to have their own personality. But that characteristic of the humanist form lived on. Now, humanist fonts don't have to be serif fonts. There are sans serif humanist fonts, tons of great ones still coming out today. And humanist fonts, like I say, have that sort of friendly attitude to them. And humanist fonts are like the ultimate Web 2.0 font. And it makes sense because Web 2.0 is a lot about making technology friendly and accessible and social. So you see it a lot. You see humanist fonts a lot in Web 2.0 logos. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, we have geometric fonts. Now, geometric fonts, rather than being derived so much from the human hand, they're more derived from geometric rationalization. So much so that Futura, which is like the ultimate geometric font, the O is like a perfect circle, which isn't the case for something like a humanist font, because human hands don't make perfect circles that well. I know I still can't. So the first geometric font would be Bodoni that we saw earlier. And he still kept sort of the thick and thin transitions in the font, but he rationalized them with geometry. So Futura, Bodoni, a couple of geometric fonts. The square logo, just as an example, it's a square, so naturally a geometric font would make sense to go with that. So you see very rounded, look, that A is like almost a perfect circle. FedEx, you may or may not know, there is an arrow in the counterform between the E and the X, and so naturally geometric forms would make that work out very well. Any fashion magazine you see pretty much is going to have a Bodoni-inspired font in the masthead. Maybe because they go well with breasts, I don't know. I'm not sure. So somewhere in between the geometric fonts and the humanist fonts are the realist fonts. And the first realist font was called the Romain du Roi. It was commissioned by Louis XIV to be the official font of the Royal French Printing House. And so they assembled a committee, and this is probably the only example of design by committee that actually went decently. And they took a very scientific approach to designing this font. And they designed it on this grid of squares. And it kind of reminds me of the pixels that are on a computer screen. And this is probably why a couple of the best fonts for the web, Georgia and Arial, are both realist fonts. You'll see realist fonts in, for example, the Flipboard logo, which is Helvetica bold, condensed. eBay is several different versions of Universe, which is similar to Helvetica. So those are the three, what I feel are the three most important categorizations of fonts that really describe the mood and the structure behind the font. So how can you tell the difference between all of these? Probably look very similar. I think that the lowercase n holds a lot of clues, because if you look at the lowercase n, the forms that are present in the lowercase n are present in a lot of the other letters in the alphabet. So here are three n's, and they probably look the exact same to you right now. Yes? Hopefully I can describe how they're different. You notice that I have sort of highlighted the shoulder on all of these. So if you look at the humanist font, Gil Sans, notice the way that the shoulder comes out of the stem. I think of it as like a spout of water. It's sort of shooting out of the stem, and it's gradually and gently falling down to earth. Now, notice Futura, that shoulder starts to come out of the stem a little bit lower. And the N is almost like a symmetrical archway. I think of it like an arch, a doorway you could walk through almost. It's a little more symmetrical. Okay? And now, Helvetica also starts coming out of the stem a little bit lower. But then notice towards the end of the N, the curve is a little more abrupt. I like to think of it if you took like a piece of iron and you were bending it to make this N, the curve would probably look a little bit like that. So those are some characteristics that you find a lot in those different fonts in, say, the N. Some little clues there. So 3 different categorizations of fonts that are pretty important to understand. Now, you can either try to find these characteristics in every font and try to understand those, but you probably have more important things to do. Here are all the fonts you will ever need. And this is, again, a gross oversimplification, because there are tons of great fonts, and there are great new fonts coming out all the time. But you could use all these fonts, you could use these fonts for pretty much the rest of your career. I mean, there's going to be some technological changes eventually that might affect things. Who knows? Maybe we'll start speaking a completely different language, and then this will go out the window. But if you were to use just these fonts for the rest of your career, it would be okay. Everything would be fine. So you could either try to memorize this list here, or take a picture of it. Better hurry, because I'm going to change the slide really soon. I'm going to be sending out a list, a PDF of this, to my email list. Now, remember, I'm still writing the book, so I have an email list, but you guys can get on and have a dialogue, because I'm still writing this book. I'm writing this book for you. So things that you want to learn about design, I want to hear about it. And I'm sharing content from the book. Next Tuesday, I'm going to send out a PDF. If you're into printing stuff out, you can do that. And I'll send a copy of this presentation too. So Thank you very much. Thanks.